the dollar's exorbitant privilege is all about. That if foreign central banks and governments want to acquire a $100 bill, or they want to acquire reserves, they have to sell us $100 of real stuff. So it is certainly profitable for the United States. And the value of that privilege, as I said before, is about equivalent to about 3% of our national income. So it's worth a significant amount to the United States that it costs us only a couple of cents to print a $100 bill, but foreigners have to give us $100 of merchandise or sell us shares, $100 worth of shares in one of their companies in order to acquire that $100 bill. So in the 1960s, President de Gaulle was so hot and bothered about the invasion of the American companies, the American invasion of Europe, the idea that we were able to buy up European companies on the cheap as a result of the fact that they needed our dollars. So yes, it's worth a considerable amount to the United States. My best guess is that if we keep we get our fiscal house in order, that we will retain many, but not all of those benefits as that privilege comes to be shared. But there is a scenario in which we could lose them entirely.
My question is related to that. It's not domestic issue versus international, though, is the unfunded liabilities of Social Security and Medicare. Those are domestic, not international trade issues, but because they have to print up so much money to fund those payments, isn't that the inflation thing that you talk about? And then how does that work on the international currency market?
So economists like when they do classroom teaching to distinguish clearly between fiscal policy and monetary policy. The problems you describe of current deficits, growing deficits in the future due to Medicare and Medicaid, and considerably further down the road, I should add, only then comes Social Security. Those are fiscal problems, budget problems. And the Fed keeps its eye basically on something else, which is the maintenance of low and stable inflation. I think it only today, it has a deal where if it makes profits as a result of its lending operations, it transfers them to the Treasury. And it transferred $80 billion, if I remember the headline figure today, to the Treasury as the profit it made last year. But, you know, that's, in principle, in the classroom, that's a separate problem. I guess at the Milken Institute, one would acknowledge that they're not entirely separate, and that if the federal government is running big budget deficits and having to sell more and more bonds to you and to the People's Bank of China, both, it will become very worried if it has to pay very high interest rates. Portugal's problem today, conceivably America's problem in a few years. In that situation, the Fed will be tempted to buy those bonds or kind of do the equivalent of not raising interest rates at the moment appropriate for keeping inflation from accelerating in order not to make the funding of the federal deficit more difficult. So, a complicated economist's answer to a simple question, but a simple answer would be that I think the way I conclude the book is that the good news is that the dollar's fate lies in our hands, not that of the Chinese. It will be domestic American politics, I think, and their implications for our fiscal performance that will determine whether the dollar remains dominant internationally or not.
In both instances where there was a major transition in world currencies and reserve currencies, it wasn't just a change in the balance of economic trade. There were major wars in both of those periods that essentially decimated the economy of the reserve currency. So, Germany and France were pretty much crushed in World War I. Britain was very much crushed in World War II, and the U.S. kind of rose through these and wasn't crushed in the same way in either of those wars, but emerged as a major economic power. Is your view that the U.S. becoming that kind of international currency would have happened anyway, but for those wars, or were they necessary to make that transition happen?
No, my view is that they would have happened anyway. That I think the fact that the United States was already a bigger economy than Britain in 1870, we were already a bigger exporter than they were in 1913, meant that if we could put certain institutional prerequisites for the development of financial markets in place, we needed to let our banks set up abroad, open foreign branches, which they weren't permitted to do before the Federal Reserve Act. We needed to establish a market maker or a liquidity provider to the markets to make them attractive to foreigners who sometimes want to sell their dollars quickly as well as buy them. I think once we did that, and so long as we otherwise followed reasonably sound and stable economic policies, it was inevitable that the dollar would have supplanted the pound sterling as the dominant international currency. So that, the timing and the way it happened were affected by World War I. They were then affected by the Great Depression of the 1930s. As I talk about in the book, the fact that we had such a severe depression in the U.S., actually much more severe than Britain's, that so many of our banks failed in the Depression, and none of theirs did, meant that the dollar gave back some of the ground that it had gained to the pound in the 1930s. So, I do think that if we had put those institutional prerequisites in place, followed reasonably sound and stable policies, the dollar would have overtaken the pound sterling with roughly the same timing. That was actually the case.
In the multipolar currency world that you envision, does the Japanese yen have a place?
So it's thank you for the question. It's revealing that I almost never get asked about the yen. And it doesn't really have a place in my mind. When I think about these issues, it's almost only my Japanese friends who chide me for neglecting the yen. The yen reached its pinnacle as an international currency, I think it was in 1988. Japanese officials set out to internationalize the yen and join the dollar on the global stage in the 1980s. And the yen, I think, at its peak in the late 1980s accounted for about 8% of the foreign exchange reserves of central banks and governments. The way they went about it kind of, how should I put it politely, breakneck liberalization resulted in a banking and financial crisis and what is now approaching 2 decades lost to economic growth. So they didn't create confidence in their currency. They didn't succeed in making it very attractive for international use. Now they're an economy that doesn't grow, and they're in demographic decline. So there will be an Asian currency that will be important on the international scene. But for my money, it's not the yen.
Professor Eichengreen, 31 years ago, the U.S. federal government had to pay 20% interest to get people to loan its money. Given that as context that probably everyone in this room has experienced, wouldn't the worst case scenario be much worse than you just said?
Certainly the scenario that you describe, where monetary and fiscal policies both are allowed to run so out of control that we were back in the world that preceded Paul Volcker. Yes, that kind of worst case scenario would be even worse than what I've described. I think there has been a considerable degree of progress on the monetary side. I think the the runaway inflation of the 1970s, and then the painful but necessary Volcker stabilization taught the country and its policymakers important lessons. I think the Fed is aware of the dangers there, and so I'm hopeful that I find it hard to imagine that U.S. monetary policy could be as bad as it was in the 1970s. But one of the reasons it was that bad was there was a lot of pressure from the politicians for the Fed not to raise rates. Richard Nixon famously berated Arthur Burns, the Ben Bernanke of the day, the head of the Fed, not to raise interest rates in 1972 when he was up for re-election, and he was doing other things in addition to arm twisting the Fed. Charles Colson, who you will know from those other Watergate-related things, among the things he did was plant stories in the Washington Post about how Arthur Burns was lobbying for a salary increase to try to, again, increase the White House's leverage over the central bank. So on the one hand, I'm confident that we've learned lessons from this history. On the other hand, I worry about how the Fed is coming under more political pressure from Capitol Hill in particular. So maybe I should have given a shorter answer and just acknowledged your point that the worst case could be even worse than I described.
Can you comment a little bit back to the euro? You talked about monetary reforms, but at least as far as I know, it's the only case where you don't have an identity between a political arm and an economic arm. With the euro, there is no equivalent political organization. So when you talk, for instance, about the U.S., we can work ourselves through some of the fiscal issues through the political process. How does that impact on your view of the euro holding together with no equivalent in Europe?
I agree with the point in the following sense, that Europe's experiment with the euro is really unprecedented historically. It's hard to think of a significant prior case where a group of middle-sized and large countries shared a currency, and where a significant global currency didn't have a state, unitary, or federal, as in our case, state behind it. So the phrase I use in the book is the euro is a currency without a state. The renminbi is a currency with too much state. So there are different sides to this problem. Europe is, in order to make the euro work, it is going to have to kind of replicate some of the functions that a federal government would carry out in a more decentralized setting. So they have a proto-executive branch. It's called the European Commission. I said earlier that I think one of the key things they have to do is take bank regulation out of the hands of self-serving national bank regulators, transfer it to a neutral party that has the interests of Europe as a whole at heart. That's called the Commission. The Commission needs to have a prominent role in bank regulation in Europe. They have a European Central Bank, even though they don't have a federal government. And I think the ECB is going to have to continue to play a role in the resolution of the crisis. Today, it went into the market for Portuguese bonds and bought, apparently, big time in order to prevent the prices from collapsing and buy those national leaders more time to all fly in from different national capitals and meet together and come to a meeting of the minds. I think they can do it, but it is that much harder by virtue of the fact that there is that the European Union is not a federation, and it won't become a federation anytime soon.
I'm adding fuel to the fire on the previous topic with the current sort of rhetoric about the unwillingness to raise the debt ceiling.